what's at issue, or what I'm talking about, is how similar the view of the world is. It hasn't changed. 50 years, and it's exactly the same.
Hello, Steve. Hello, Joe. Hope you guys had a good weekend. And by the way, just as we start this, I want to let people know that we've had a lot of comments about the restructuring global trading video we did last week. And people have more questions. So just to let everybody know, we're going to be doing a part two sometime this week, maybe tomorrow. I don't know if you guys have watched this movie or not. Ran across it this weekend. And it's a story of a president who wants a weaker dollar and attaches a 10% across the board tariff on everybody. Now, I'm pretty sure that this movie doesn't have a 100% tariff on it. But just in case you're wondering, this is a movie that was made in 1971. And so we're seeing the sequel today, but it's a crazy movie. So I don't know, just trying
Bob, unfortunately, it's not a movie, buddy.
to.
I got to listen. You guys know I love history, man, and I spend a lot of time talking about things that have happened in the past and so forth, because I'm of the opinion that basically there's nothing new under the sun. Everything that can happen's already happened once or twice before, and probably many times before. But this one really kind of blew my mind. I got to tell you. I tell people, like, for instance, I'll give you an example of something that people think, oh, well, they didn't do this stuff back then. The tulip bubble back in the 1600s in the Netherlands was driven by futures contracts and options on futures contracts. Yeah, that was 400 years ago. Well, yeah, I mean, come on. Yeah, it doesn't matter. You think these things are modern. They're not. It's just not. Anyway, back to the topic at hand of the president who wants to have a cheaper dollar. Yeah, this is the Nixon administration. Listen, I was thinking about what the Trump administration is doing, and I've been deep into this Moran paper about it. And by the way, the Moran paper, we will talk more about it this week, because there's some interesting stuff going on right now, actually, that relates directly to that paper. To me, it's just kind of a laundry list. It's like, hey, here's what we want to do, and here's a whole bunch of stuff we can use to justify it, or here's a bunch of stuff, or different, also a bunch of ways we can accomplish what it is that we want to do. But I think the real gist of the paper, and what you really got to concentrate on, is that it's about devaluing the dollar. That's really what they see as the problem, is that the dollar's overvalued. That because other governments are manipulating their currencies, they're accumulating treasuries, accumulating dollars, and holding the dollar up and their currencies down, and that gives them a trade advantage. That's the whole gist of the paper. So, what I was interested in thinking about the Nixon administration, because I knew that, for instance, the Nixon administration had, obviously, everybody knows that they were the ones that Nixon was the one that took us off the Bretton Woods monetary system, or removed us from the Bretton Woods monetary system, which was the point in 1973 where the dollar was finally severed completely from gold. And but I didn't know a lot of the didetails. And listen, I grew up during this time, but in 1971 I was 10. So I'm an old guy, but I'm not that old. So I didn't really have a good handle on what was going on. So I went and did some research, which is what I always do when I'm wondering about things. And I'll tell you something too, by the way, research. You know, be careful when you read things online. Go do your own research. A lot of times, what you find is that what the real story is completely different than what you're seeing out there on Twitter or on Facebook, or even from CNN or MSNBC or whatever, or Fox. You got to do your own research. You got to draw your own conclusions. So that's what I always do. So I went back and I read what was known as the Nixon shock speech, August 15th, 1971, when he first talked about a lot of this stuff, about how there was this stress in the system and that he had a plan to relieve it. And as I read the speech, and then that led me to reading some things on the Richard Nixon Foundation webpage about that time. And it just struck me about how similar the program is that the Trump administration is rolling out right now to the Nixon administration. it's not just that, for instance, we want to devalue the dollar as Nixon, and I don't, Nixon, and it's actually the really odd, not odd, the really fascinating thing is that Nixon and Trump use very similar language. Nixon is very careful in this speech to say he's not going to devalue the dollar. He says, he says that we have to maintain a strong dollar. And in that speech, he says something to the effect that, well, we're going to impose these tariffs and that's going to raise prices on foreign stuff and the dollar is going to go down. That's going to make foreign things more expensive. If you want to travel to Europe, it's going to cost you a little bit more. If you want to buy a foreign car, it's going to cost you a little more. But all you got to do is to avoid it is to buy American. Now, if that doesn't sound like Donald Trump, I don't know what does, man. Holy cow, that's right out of the playbook. So Nixon talks about how other countries, this Bretton Woods system has got us with an overvalued dollar. And that he even talks about other countries accumulating dollar reserves. That's exactly what the Moran paper is all about. He says that's the source of our problem. All these countries have been accumulating these dollar reserves and forcing the dollar to an overvaluation. Well, that's exactly what Stephen Moran has said. So that's very fascinating. But even more parallels. For instance, Nixon says that the rest of the world is not doing their part to ensure global freedom. Well, there's a lot of different ways you can interpret that, but the bottom line is what he's saying is these other countries are slacking off. They're not paying their fair share of the global defense budget. Well, again, I'm sorry, but that's Donald Trump. And by the way, Donald Trump actually got him to pay more. So I guess he was a little more successful on that front. Here's another one. Nixon very famously pressured Arthur Burns. Arthur Burns is nobody in the Federal Reserve ever wants to be known as the next Arthur Burns. Why? Well, because Arthur Burns was the Fed chair who Nixon famously just beat up until he cut rates and got him reelected in 72. He was the guy who did bend to the political pressure and did do things that ultimately ended up with a lot of inflation after that election. So again, we've got another parallel. President Trump has pressured Jerome Powell to cut interest rates. Anyway, it just goes on and on. And listen, I don't want to make this more complicated than it is. Look, here's the bottom line. The Trump administration wants a cheaper dollar. They think that's a big problem with trade. And listen, if you go back and look at how Bretton Woods was structured, one of the things that's talked about there is if you run these persistent trade deficits, that means that you need to adjust your currency. Now remember, Bretton Woods was a fixed exchange rate system. So at that time, dollar was fixed to gold at $35 an ounce. And Bretton Woods had a mechanism through the IMF and through the World Bank to say, if you're a country that's running a persistent trade surplus with the United States or with anybody in the group, then you're going to have to adjust your currency. That was the remedy of Bretton Woods. And so that's what Nixon was trying to do. He was trying to force the Bretton Woods system to maintain it by getting the institutions that come along with it to enforce the rules, so to speak. Well, again, it sounds just like Donald Trump. Hey, the WTO, it doesn't enforce the rules. Regardless of the truth of any of these things, by the way, that's not what's at issue here. What's at issue or what I'm talking about is how similar the view of the world is. It hasn't changed. 50 years and it's exactly the same complaints, exactly the same solutions. It is stunning to me. And by the way, the aftermath of this, Nixon was able to get other countries to agree to raise the value of their currencies. They devalued the dollar against gold from 35 to 38 bucks an ounce in 1971, December of 1971. Other countries did raise the value of their currencies. It just wasn't enough. And by 73, the speculators in the market, particularly with gold and the dollar, they forced the end of Bretton Woods, and all currencies floated after that, floating rate currencies. And so we know what the results of that were. They were not pretty. We got what, as I said in the piece, economists had to invent a new word. They'd never seen this before. What the stagflation? You mean that I'm getting inflation and growth gone to hell too? That's like the worst of all worlds. Now, look, I'm not saying we're going to get the same result because I don't, there's a lot of things in the 70s that are not the same as they are today. And one of those things, by the way, and this is something I think is just you have to really think about this, is the time. Listen, at the time, I mean, everybody thought of money as gold. That gold was money. The dollar had been tied to gold almost, you know, consistently since the beginning of our country. Yeah, you came off at various times for certain things. You came off gold in 18 for the War of 1812. You came off gold for the Civil War. You came off gold for World War One, or well, not completely off of World War One. World War Two, during the Depression, FDR devalued the dollar. Prior to, remember we said 35 bucks an ounce in 1971. Well, prior to that, it was 20 something back during when FDR was in there. He devalued the dollar too. So my point is though that gold was always central. Gold was the North Star. And man, when you knock that out, man, people didn't know what to do. And so I think that's why, the decade of the 70s, because that what happened in 1971 to 1973, that reverberated through the whole decade. And I think it took that long because it just took that long for people to adjust. That's not true anymore. We haven't had gold as that North Star for a long time. So I suspect whatever adjustment we get, it's not going to take as long. But we do know kind of the general direction of it. So that it's nice that they've copied the Nixon playbook because now we know what to do.
So, Steve, Joe said two or three times there at the very end that gold was the North Star. What's our North Star today?
I mean, I do think you could actually still look at gold to a degree as having been the canary in the coal mine for some of the stuff that's going on, preceding some of these markets and going higher. I mean, it certainly, as Joe points out, is playing a different role today. It's not as central, but I kind of would still look at gold here as being one of the leading indicators. It's telling us something's up with the monetary system. Um, I also just kind of want to back Joe up here in that, well, let me just say this job sucks. I mean, part of this job is just having nightmares, coming up with what could go wrong, what has gone wrong before, what's kind of the worst case scenario, kind of so I can game it, prepare for it, try to avoid it. And not that and Joe alluded to this, that we're not baked into repeating bell bottoms, gas lines, and stagflation, and in a complete disco is not necessarily coming back. Um, you know, things do change. They're never perfect parallels. But there are some things, and Joe pointed out some of them with the policy. I think you have to take a very close look at as possibly repeating or possibly giving you lessons. And if anything, I think Joe and I have almost maybe gotten a little ahead of ourselves. I think rightly so. But we've been almost talking about like a weak dollar being policy of the Trump administration because all the dots are connecting that way, even though they're saying the opposite. So I'm right there. When you took a look at what they're saying and read between the lines, it seems to be kind of saying we need the dollar to come down. And then there's that parallel. Some other parallels too. I mean, you had the Nifty 50 back then. You had these high valuation U.S. stocks. The idea that you just had to buy the biggest, best U.S. companies, and you didn't have to pay attention to valuations. And that didn't work out so well. Another kind of eerie parallel is that you had a big exogenous supply shock around a war, the Yom Kippur War, involving the commodity of the day. And right now we're worried about the potential for the commodity of the day. Now semiconductors rather than oil going offline. I mean, we just had the Chinese do a military drill where they basically practiced embargoing the entire island. And I got to tell you, you want a parallel supply shock? Oh, cutting off about 90% of leading edge semiconductors will get you there to that kind of a huge inflation shock. So I think there's parallels you have to keep in mind, but nothing's perfect. One of the weird things about today in terms of nightmares, where could things go wrong? I also look at like the 2000s, right? We had this big investment in the internet. It didn't pay off. All that capex got ratcheted back. You had these high valuations concentrated in the tech sector, and you had a reset there. And then you had a falling period with a weak dollar period there. I think you can take a look at 1929. You had tariffs, you had trade wars. You had the final breakdowns of a global great power system underpinned by the British Empire that was really on its last legs, and you were going to have a reset, as well as you had well, today we've got China doing the biggest military buildup since Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. So you can draw some parallels there. In our business, I think you have to look at all of them and say, is this potentially happening? Is that potentially happening? Um, and my guess is it's going to be a little bit of something new, and a mix of all of it to a degree. But I think in that mix, for sure, you should have some worries about stagflation. You should have some worries about some of the 70s, including some of those Nixon policies getting repeated because they sound similar. We've got increased, we've had inflationary pressures. The Fed's not getting it down below that 2%. There seems to be higher structural inflation. Growth has not really been great really since '08. So yeah, I think you got to be, that can be another nightmare to throw in the bag for us to worry about. But I think that the big takeaway here in Navy is like what all this seems to be pointing to right now is a weak dollar, and we know how to invest for that. And there's a lot of reasons, including Nixon policies, including the 70s, to be concerned that you might, if you've got a portfolio that's predicated on a strong US dollar, you might want to start rethinking that or having some other plans.
Well, Joe, this goes back to something I've heard you say for years and years and years, that generally cycles are not exact parallels, but they sure do rhyme.
Yeah, that's another one of those. One of my favorite things in writing a lot is to find these quotes that people think are were said by someone that really weren't. I used one of them this week. That's another one though, that that history doesn't repeat itself. It rhymes. And actually, I would say what really is happening there is that historians repeat themselves. But anyway, that's not a true quote from Mark Twain, which is what everybody gives it to him. I'm not sure exactly where that comes from. I forget. I did the research on that once, but anyway, I used one this week about Churchill. Churchill said that Americans can be counted on to do the right thing after they've exhausted all the other possibilities, and which is kind of insulting to the United States. But actually, there's no source whatsoever that says Churchill ever said that. As I said in the piece too, if he didn't say it, he sure should have. It's a great line. It's a great line. Um, yeah, the parallels here are kind of eerie. Like I said, I'll give you another one. 19. Look at the inflation rate. We had an outbreak of inflation in the 60s, 66 to 69. Really, inflation and interest rates have been rising. You peaked at a little over 6% in 1969, late 69. It could have been early 70, I guess, or in 1970, I guess it was, because I think it was after the election. That's for sure. Because Nixon, like his modern day counterpart, was very careful to say that wasn't me, man. That was those guys over. That was the guy before me. I didn't do that. So, but you got this peak, and it came back down. Inflation came back down, but it didn't get back down to where it was before. And then we got all this other stuff in 1973. We finally severed the gold link, and inflation took off again. So are we in that interim period now where it's falling back and it's going to surge again? Well, I don't know. I tell you, if we keep devaluing the dollar, we know that devaluing the dollar is certainly inflationary. That is in fact, devaluing the dollar, your falling currency is the very definition of inflation. Rising prices are the effect. The definition of inflation is to reduce your purchasing power of your currency. And that's what we're actually trying to do, which makes no sense, but that's what we're doing. Well, I don't want to say it makes no sense, but it doesn't make a lot of sense. Hey, let's make everything more expensive. I don't like that idea. I'm kind of like that when my dollars buy lots of stuff. I've often said, and this is a joke, by the way. This is not because it's not literally true. When Steve and I've talked about this, that the Chinese certainly did cheat, certainly in the mid '90s when they devalued the yuan. I've often said, kind of jokingly, that if other countries are willing to send us real stuff for these little green pieces of paper, I think we ought to do that trade all day. Let's send them a whole boatload of little green pieces of paper and have them send us real stuff. I think it's a pretty good trade-off. The reason I say it's kind of a joke is, look, we know that trade like this with China and so forth, a lot of these trade issues that came up, it affected a lot of people in a negative way. There are winners and losers in just about any policy change, and certainly there were losers in this shift to more free trade in the 1990s. So I want to go back to something that Steve said. Steve started talking about the 1970s, how we don't want to repeat that, bell bottoms and I got to tell you, man, I have a picture of me, I think in the eighth grade in a leisure suit that you would not believe. Oh my God. Remember those paisley shirts? You had the collar on the outside of the leisure suit. Oh my God, it's bad. So we definitely don't want to repeat that. But I would also say too, there were some good things in the 70s, man. I don't know if you guys have seen this yet. There's a documentary out about Led Zeppelin, which is absolutely fabulous. There was a lot of great music in the 1970s. We think about the disco because that was the bad stuff, but man, there was a lot of good music in there too. So listen, we'll get through the economic stuff. We know what to do. We've got a blueprint, man. We know what happened in the Nixon administration. We know what worked in the 1970s. And not only that, we've got two other periods after that where the dollar went down, 1985 to 1994, basically. And then that period 2002 to 2008. We know what works, so we can get through that. Let's maybe try to focus some on the other things that we got out of the 1970s, which weren't all bad. So I will just say that my musical education in the 1970s was thorough. Anybody wants to talk about 1970s music, we can get on that topic on a future video.
Well, and I think let's just pull something from Bachman Turner Overdrive because what we have done today is taken care of business. So listen, if you're having a hard time negotiating all of these parallels and wondering what's going on, we can help. Like Joe said, we know what works. What Steve said, we know what works. Shoot us an email at info@alhambrapartners.com. Let's have a discussion.